Welcome, my dear friends, my fellow lovers of stories, of words, of ideas that spill over from the pages of books into the worlds we find on screen. I'm so glad you've chosen to sit with me here for a while, to share in this exploration. Before we dive in, I'll ask gently, if you haven't already, to like and subscribe. Think of it as leaving a note in the margin of a favorite text, a sign that this kind of reflection means something to you. What we're about to embark on is not a conventional review, and I want to make that perfectly clear. This isn't about rating or recommending, or even critiquing in the traditional sense. Instead, what I'm offering is an intellectual and theoretical dive, a way of approaching this film almost as though it were a piece of literature. It's not a review, it's a kind of reading, meant for those of us who love the challenge and the joy of finding deeper resonance in art that others might dismiss as mere spectacle. The film in question today is Fast and Furious Presents, Hobbs Shaw, and while on the surface it may seem like just another loud, high-octane blockbuster, for me it offers so much more to consider, about masculinity, about family, about the balance of chaos and control in our lives. When I first watched it, I expected noise. I expected engines roaring and fists colliding. And of course, I found that. But what surprised me was the quiet, subtle texture underneath. The story of two men so impossibly different that they can't help but clash at every turn, yet so inevitably tied together that their survival depends on unity. In a way, it made me reflect on my own life. The people I've struggled with, the relationships where difference was the loudest thing in the room, but also where growth came not from avoiding conflict, but from navigating through it. The film reminded me that sometimes what grates against us most is also what sharpens us, and there's something almost poetic in that. From the very beginning, the film sets itself apart from its franchise siblings. Rather than immersing us in the familiar world of fast cars and elaborate heists, it pivots towards something more intimate. Though intimate, here still means globe-trotting, skyscraper leaping, motorcycle flipping chaos. But beneath the choreography of impossible stunts lies a story of unlikely partnership. Two men, each locked into his own identity like a fortress, are forced into collaboration when the world threatens to collapse. One is all blunt force and gruff honor, a man who seems to carry entire mountains on his shoulders without complaint. The other is sleek, sharp, calculated, a figure who treats life as though it were a chessboard, with every move carefully plotted. Watching them together is like watching two different languages attempt to translate one another in real time, both clumsy and strangely beautiful. The world they inhabit feels both familiar and exaggerated. It's our world, yes, but turned up to an almost mythic register. London's streets shimmer with rain-slicked danger, labs and towers gleam with corporate menace, and later, the landscapes of Samoa blaze with earthy power and ancestral weight. Each location feels symbolic, not just practical. London's greyness underscores the suffocating presence of order and surveillance. The sterile labs remind us of a modern Promethean hubris, the attempt to control biology itself. And Samoa, with its raw land and traditions, grounds the film in the enduring idea of family, community, and the strength that comes from heritage. I remember watching those shifts in setting and feeling them less as background than as emotional mirrors, amplifying what the characters themselves were struggling with. The story unfolds with the intrusion of an enemy that feels both futuristic and eerily possible. Technology here is not merely an aid, but a weapon, embodied in a figure who is more machine than man. He isn't just an antagonist, he's an idea, the fear of a future where the human body itself becomes obsolete, where strength and cunning are no longer enough against engineered perfection. That struck me deeply, because in so many ways we live with that tension already. Machines that can outthink us, algorithms that know our desires before we voice them, systems that reduce our humanity to data. In this enemy, I saw not just a villain but a projection of our own anxieties, a challenge that forces the heroes to cling to what makes them human: loyalty, resilience, imperfection itself. The interplay between the two leads is, of course, the beating heart of the narrative. Their banter is sharp, sometimes cruel, always tinged with a reluctant respect. I remember laughing at the absurdity of some of their insults, but beneath the comedy, I recognized something real. The way we often mask vulnerability with humor, the way rivalry can be a safer way to express connection than confession. There's a scene where they bicker endlessly while surrounded by chaos, and I thought, isn't that just like life? We argue and nitpick even as the world feels like it's crumbling, because it's easier to fight about trivialities than face the magnitude of what we're up against. As the story barrels forward, the stakes expand. What begins as a mission rooted in stopping a viral weapon becomes something larger. A meditation on trust, on blood versus choice, on the possibility of reconciliation in a fractured world. The virus itself feels allegorical, a reminder of the unseen forces, whether political, technological, or emotional, that can spread through our lives and destabilize everything we thought secure. I found myself thinking less about the plausibility of the plot, which, if we're honest, isn't meant to be measured by realism, and more about what it symbolized. The characters aren't just fighting a biological threat. They're fighting despair, division, and the seductive pull of power unmoored from morality. The narrative's most stirring moments come not from the explosions or the chases, but from the quiet revelations. Family bonds resurfacing, sacrifices made, grudges softened. When the story shifts to a more ancestral setting, it becomes almost mythological in tone. The confrontation ceases to be just about survival and transforms into a ritual of return, a reclaiming of roots and identity. Watching those scenes, I felt a swell of something beyond entertainment, an echo of the way stories remind us that in the end, we are never just individuals, but threads in a larger tapestry of family and history. It's easy to forget that in our daily lives, caught up in the frantic rush of survival and ambition. But here, in this improbable blockbuster, that truth finds its way back to us. And yes, there are twists. There are betrayals and revelations, surprises tucked into the narrative like sparks waiting for oxygen. Some are predictable in the way myths often are. You know that certain arcs must bend toward reconciliation, that enemies must sometimes reveal their hidden humanity. But even when I saw them coming, I didn't mind. There is comfort in inevitability, in the way certain stories unfold like rituals we've known all along. And then there were other twists that jolted me, reminding me that even in formula, there is room for surprise. By the end, I found myself less concerned with the plausibility of what I had watched and more grateful for the resonance it left me with. It reminded me that stories don't always need to be subtle to be meaningful, that even bombast and bravado can carry kernels of truth. Beneath the roar of engines and the clash of fists, there was an old, timeless story, about difference finding harmony, about family chosen and inherited, about the fragile strength of being human in a world that often seems determined to strip humanity away. For me, this film connected to something personal. I thought about my own family, about conflicts that once felt insurmountable but softened over time. I thought about friends with whom I've shared more arguments than agreements, yet whose presence in my life has been essential. And I thought about the balance we all try to strike, between pride and vulnerability, between independence and connection. Somehow, in its wild, impossible way, this film captured all of that. So, while on the surface it may appear as a pulsing, muscle-bound spectacle, what I experienced was something closer to a parable dressed in action. A parable about stubbornness, about the absurdity of rivalry, about the surprising beauty of unity when it finally, painfully, arrives. And I suppose that's why I wanted to share this reflection with you. Because beneath the noise, there is poetry. Beneath the spectacle, there is substance. And for those of us who love to look deeply, who enjoy finding the glimmers of meaning scattered where others may not expect them, this film offers far more than it might first appear. As I close this reflection, I feel grateful, not just for the story itself, but for the chance to sit with you and unravel it together. Stories like this remind me that meaning doesn't always arrive in the form we expect. Sometimes, it comes roaring in on a motorcycle, clad in leather and sarcasm. And if we allow ourselves to look closely, to read between the explosions, we might just find ourselves reflected in the unlikeliest of places. The memory of that opening still lingers in my mind, not because of its subtlety, but because of its sharp insistence on rhythm. It begins with a split screen, two worlds colliding before they even know they are destined to do so. On one side, there is the clean, methodical ritual of a man who thrives in order. Every movement is deliberate, every step toward the day carefully measured. The toothbrush is wielded like a weapon of precision, breakfast consumed like a soldier preparing for battle. On the other side, the chaos of life bursts forth in a completely different register. A man whose world is noise and motion, whose routine is barely a routine at all. He's all gruff humor, unfiltered confidence, and unapologetic swagger, tossing food down without ceremony, glaring at the world as if it owes him something. Two men, two symphonies playing in wildly different keys, already brushing against each other, without yet touching. What fascinated me here wasn't just the humor of contrast. Though, yes, it's funny, but the way it establishes character without dialogue. In literature, this is the kind of moment that feels almost novelistic, like the first lines of a story where two archetypes are being carved out of opposites. And yet, in film, it happens in a flash. It reminded me of mornings in my own life, those days where I've shared a roof with someone so utterly different from myself that even making coffee seemed like a duel of philosophies. Watching them side by side like this, I couldn't help but laugh, not just at the film but at myself, at the universality of such tension. Not long after, the piece, or rather, the rhythm, is broken. A weapon is introduced, not in the traditional sense of guns or bombs, but something far more terrifying. A biological threat, engineered to end the world quietly, invisibly. We watch as it slips from the shadows, carried by a group who clearly understand its weight. The package is pursued, the streets become a battleground, and amidst the chaos, a figure emerges who seems almost untouchable. His strength is amplified, his body a machine disguised as flesh. There is a cold elegance to him, a predator unhurried, because he knows no one can keep pace. He is not simply a villain, but a warning, a glimpse of a world where technology rewrites the laws of human survival. One woman, however, refuses to yield. She is not painted as fragile or secondary, but as someone who makes a decision that defines her arc. To protect rather than surrender, even if it means carrying the burden herself. Her choice is bold, desperate, almost reckless, but it reverberates through everything that follows. Watching her in that moment reminded me of the times in my own life when instinct took over, when logic would have told me to walk away, but something in my bones insisted I take the risk instead. That decision, messy, dangerous, human, becomes the spark that ignites the entire story. This is where the threads begin to pull tighter. Orders are given. Two men, those opposites we glimpsed earlier, are called to action. Neither is happy about it, each recoiling at the idea of working with the other. Their distaste is palpable, their words sharp, their disdain almost theatrical. And yet, as much as they resist, we already know the truth. They are tethered to one another by necessity. What unfolds in those early scenes is less about action than about stubbornness, about two immovable forces insisting they will not bend. It reminded me of conversations I've had with people who mirror my worst traits, where every sentence felt like pushing against a brick wall. Watching it here, through humor and bravado, felt strangely cathartic, as though the film was holding up a mirror and saying, "See how absurd this can be." When the mission begins in earnest, the stage shifts. The streets of London open wide, bustling yet tinged with menace. Rain glints off black pavement, neon signs cut through fog, and hidden within the city's veins are enemies and allies alike. It is here the first true confrontation unfolds. A chase, a clash, a revelation of just how formidable their opponent is. And as the two men attempt to pursue him, their differences aren't just inconvenient, they are dangerous. One favors brute force, smashing through obstacles without hesitation. The other prefers elegance, weaving through the chaos with finesse. Watching them side by side, I felt the tension in my chest. How often in life do we find ourselves paired with someone whose methods not only differ from ours, but seem designed to sabotage them? In those moments, failure feels inevitable. And yet, there is something thrilling about failure too. Because failure forces growth. Their quarry escapes, their frustrations boil over, and the audience is left with the clear sense that this partnership is doomed, unless they learn to bend. But the narrative refuses to let them rest in bickering. New layers are introduced. Family connections emerge, stories of betrayal and loyalty tangled together. The woman who carried the burden of the biological weapon becomes not just a fugitive, but a key figure, tied by blood and history to one of the reluctant partners. This complicates everything. Trust becomes murky, suspicion grows, and the line between professional duty and personal loyalty blurs. I found myself leaning closer at this point, not because of the spectacle, but because of the intimacy. It reminded me of the way life never divides cleanly between the personal and the professional, how obligations to family often collide with obligations to duty. And in that collision, chaos is born. The enemy, meanwhile, grows more menacing. He is not just strong but calculating, a man who believes himself to be the next stage of evolution. He speaks with conviction, as though his mission is not conquest but destiny. There is something chilling about that, because history has shown us time and again that the most dangerous individuals are not those who lust for power, but those who believe they are enacting inevitability. Watching him, I couldn't help but think of the real-world ideologies that have dressed themselves in the language of progress while leaving destruction in their wake. As the story builds, The set pieces grow larger, yet I noticed how carefully they are tied to emotion. A car chase isn't just spectacle, it's a metaphor for trust. A brawl isn't just fists flying, it's an argument made physical. Even the quieter moments, tucked between explosions, carry weight. There's a scene where one character sits, shoulders heavy, reflecting on his family and the choices that brought him here. In that moment, the camera lingers, and I thought of my own family, the weight of expectations, the unspoken sacrifices. It's easy to forget in the rush of action films that these quieter beats are often what make the noise matter. Without them, explosions are just noise. With them, they become echoes of something deeper. By the midpoint, the pieces are all set. The virus, now revealed to be more dangerous than imagined, is ticking away like a silent clock. The villains are closing in, their reach extending beyond borders. The heroes are battered, their partnership strained to breaking. And yet, amid the chaos, there are flickers of connection, reluctant glances, unspoken acknowledgements, the barest hints of respect. It feels inevitable, in the way myths often do, that the very things keeping them apart will be what ultimately binds them. And as the world expands, so too does the sense of inevitability. The settings shift, the action heightens, but underneath it all, the theme remains constant. The tension between opposites, the fragile dance of survival and trust. By this point, I was no longer watching two men on a mission. I was watching a parable unfold, one that reminded me of arguments I've lived through, partnerships I've resisted, and the way life so often demands we find common ground with those we least expect to stand beside. That first stretch of the film, then, isn't simply about setting up a story. It's about creating a stage where opposites must collide, where loyalty is tested, where power threatens to overwhelm humanity. And even though the explosions and chases keep the pulse racing, it's the quieter truths, the stubbornness of pride, the weight of family, the fear of obsolescence, that stay with me long after the screen fades to black. The story continues with an urgency that feels heavier than before, as though the ground beneath the characters has shifted, and every step forward carries with it a sense of reckoning. The weapon they sought to contain has now become a ticking spectre, lodged within the body of someone who had only wanted to protect it. That choice, the desperate act of preservation, has turned into a curse, threading together loyalty and danger in a way that cannot be ignored. From this moment onward, the stakes are no longer abstract. They are personal, immediate, pressing against the skin like an invisible weight. It is in this phase that the partnership begins to reveal its hidden potential. The two men, so stubborn in their individuality, find themselves pressed into corners where pride is no longer an option. The enemy, relentless and eerily calm, circles them with technological precision, every movement designed to remind them of their fragility. But something fascinating happens here. The insults remain, the bickering doesn't stop, yet beneath it is the unmistakable pulse of trust. The very friction that threatened to destroy them begins to serve as a strange kind of glue. It is as if they realize that the very qualities that make them unbearable to each other are exactly what makes them indispensable. What follows is a gauntlet of trials, each more extreme than the last. They infiltrate secure facilities, outrun machines designed to predict their every move, and in doing so, they begin to understand the true shape of their adversary's plan. The villain does not simply want to unleash destruction. He wants to reset the world, to burn away weakness in the name of creating something stronger, more efficient, more controlled. It's a chilling vision of the future, one where humanity itself is treated as expendable. Watching it unfold, I couldn't help but think of the real-world conversations we have about technology and its grip over our lives. Algorithms shaping our choices, machines edging into spaces we once thought sacredly human. The film, in its bombastic way, turns that fear into flesh. The mission grows more desperate when they realize that time is no longer on their side. The woman who has carried the burden of the virus is running out of hours, and the enemy knows it. Every attempt to evade him feels like a narrowing corridor, every plan less certain than the last. The tension lies not just in whether they can stop the antagonist, but in whether they can save her before her sacrifice becomes irreversible. These scenes struck me deeply, not for their action, but for their undercurrent of inevitability. How many times in life do we feel that weight, that creeping sense that no matter how fast we move, the clock will always outrun us? At this point, the film begins to draw its threads towards something greater than just survival. The narrative pulls the characters toward a place that is not foreign but ancestral, away from steel towers and neon streets, back to land and bloodlines that cannot be erased. When the story shifts to the island, it feels like an exhale after relentless pursuit, though one filled with foreboding. The colors change. The air seems thicker, richer. Here, family is not an idea, but a living force, and the protagonist, who once seemed like an immovable fortress, finally shows the cracks in his armor. His return home is not just geographical, it is emotional. He confronts a past filled with unresolved wounds, a father once idolized and then abandoned, brothers who see his absence as betrayal. These confrontations sting more deeply than any fistfight. They reveal the truth that our greatest battles are often not fought against enemies outside us, but against the people we love most, and the versions of ourselves we left behind. And yet, it is here, among family, that the path forward becomes clear. The film becomes almost mythological in tone, echoing the structure of epics, where the hero must return to his roots in order to face the final test. The old weapons are dusted off, traditions rise alongside futuristic threats, and the clash becomes not just one of strength, but of identity. In this space, the partnership that once seemed impossible finally feels inevitable. Pride gives way to unity, and the two men who could hardly stand each other now stand as brothers in arms. The transformation is subtle yet profound, and I found myself smiling at its familiarity. Isn't it true that the people we resist most fiercely often end up becoming part of our story, in ways we could never have predicted? The climax is both thunderous and intimate. On one hand, it delivers what we expect: grand battles, impossible stunts, explosions painted across the canvas of the sky. On the other, it narrows in on the simplest truth: no one survives alone. In the final confrontation with the machine-like adversary, this truth is laid bare. Individually, neither man is enough. Every attempt they make alone is met with failure. It is only when they surrender to the rhythm of partnership, when they finally synchronize strength with strategy, that they begin to turn the tide. That scene, with fists and fury colliding against an opponent who seems untouchable, becomes less about violence and more about surrendering pride. It's a parable of humility disguised as spectacle. The resolution of the biological threat comes in a way that is both suspenseful and cathartic. The race against time, the question of whether she can be saved, carries us to the edge of despair. Yet, it is her resilience, her refusal to be reduced to a victim, that ultimately delivers salvation. In a story dominated by masculine bravado, it is striking that the pivot hinges on her strength. She is not a passive figure waiting for rescue, but an active force shaping the outcome. That choice by the narrative felt refreshing, a reminder that courage is not limited to muscle or arrogance, but to willpower, sacrifice, and determination. By the end, the storm has passed, but the echoes remain. The villain is defeated, yet the ideas he embodied linger like smoke after a fire. The threat of a world stripped of its humanity is not erased, only delayed. And the partnership that seemed unthinkable at the start has become something resembling friendship, though not the kind sealed with embraces or declarations, but the rough, begrudging respect of two men who have survived something impossible together. That, in itself, felt truer than any neat resolution. What stayed with me most, though, was not the victory but the themes humming underneath it. Family, not as a slogan but as a lived, complicated truth, fractured, painful, yet ultimately unshakable. Identity, not as something inherited, but as something constantly renegotiated between past and present. And the strange beauty of unity born from conflict, of strength discovered not in isolation, but in interdependence. As the final moments unfold, there is laughter again, rough, teasing, sharp as ever. But now it feels different. It's no longer the laughter of disdain, but of recognition, the kind of laughter that can only exist between people who have bled beside one another. The story closes not with peace, but with balance, fragile yet real. And in that balance lies the promise that perhaps, against all odds, difference does not have to divide us. It can sometimes be the very thing that saves us. Sitting with the story afterward, I thought of my own life, of the people I once swore I could never work alongside, who ended up teaching me lessons I never expected, of the family members I clashed with, whose love revealed itself in the moments I least deserved it, and of the fear we all share, that we may someday be outpaced by the world around us, our humanity drowned in the tide of progress. This tale, beneath all its roaring engines and crashing fists, reminded me that the answer is not to fight alone, but to find strength in connection, even with those we once resisted most. That, perhaps, is the quiet truth hidden beneath the spectacle, that unity is never easy, never tidy, but always worth the struggle. And as the screen fades, What lingers is not just the memory of battles won, but the reminder that sometimes the hardest fight is not against enemies out there, but against the walls we build between ourselves. What has always struck me most about this story isn't simply the stunts or the spectacle, though those are loud enough to shake any theatre seat. It's the people inside the chaos, the way they move through the world, shaped by scars, pride, humor, and pain. The characters are larger than life, yes, but they are not hollow. They are built from contradictions, and those contradictions are what make them feel alive. I remember sitting there, not just watching them punch and drive their way through impossible odds, but wondering what each of them was holding inside, what truths they were running from or clinging to. That curiosity never left me, and it's what makes reflecting on them now feel more like storytelling than analysis. Let me begin with the mountain of a man who thrives on control, the one whose very presence feels like a stone fortress standing against the storm. He's the kind of character who doesn't bend, at least not easily. His life is measured, his choices exact, and his morality runs deep into the soil of his identity. And yet, beneath all that steel, there is something raw, something unfinished. He carries family like a weight strapped to his back, equal parts pride and burden. I found myself thinking of him as a man who cannot afford to falter, who cannot risk weakness because too many people have leaned on him for too long. He is the sort who would rather swallow his pain than admit it exists, and in that silence lies both his strength and his wound. His return home later in the story is what truly pulled me closer to him. Watching him face the family he left behind was not about action at all. It was about the vulnerability of someone who built walls, so high even his own blood couldn't scale them. I recognized that feeling. Haven't we all, at some point, walked into a room where history weighed heavier than words, where every glance carried accusations that no apology could erase? That's what I saw in him, not just the unbreakable agent of law and order, but a son, a brother, a man struggling to reconcile the man he became with the boy who once belonged to a family he abandoned. His fists may have been his weapon, but his true battle was always internal. Then there's the slick, sharp, fast-talking figure who thrives on style as much as substance. He is everything the other is not, grace where the other is blunt, sarcasm where the other is silence, finesse where the other is sheer force. At first glance, he appears to be little more than a provocateur, a man who masks vulnerability with wit and deception. But the longer I watched him, the more I noticed the cracks. Behind the smirk is a man who knows loneliness intimately, who has built his identity around mistrust because trusting has cost him too much. His humor, biting as it is, feels less like arrogance and more like armor. And I couldn't help but feel that armor was stitched together over years of betrayal, loss, and survival. The relationship between these two men fascinated me endlessly, because it wasn't just about contrast. It was about mirrors. Each of them, in his own way, hides behind something. One behind stoicism, the other behind sarcasm. One hides in silence, the other in noise. Yet both are hiding the same wound, the fear of being vulnerable, of needing someone else. Watching them clash was entertaining, yes, but watching them slowly, reluctantly, recognize themselves in each other was deeply moving. It reminded me of the friendships in my own life that began in arguments, in eye rolls and disagreements, only to deepen into bonds that have carried me through some of the hardest seasons. But the heart of the story isn't just in them. It beats strongly in the woman who refuses to be defined by fragility. She carries within her the burden of the weapon itself, yet she never once feels like a plot device. Instead, she is active, decisive, unflinching. What I admired most about her was how she embodied strength, not by mimicking the men around her, but by showing a different kind of resilience. Her choices are driven by conviction rather than ego, her courage born not from bravado, but from clarity. Watching her reminded me of people I've known who seem to step into fire without hesitation, not because they are reckless, but because they believe so deeply in what must be done. She became, for me, the moral compass of the narrative, the one whose actions carried the weight of sacrifice without drowning in spectacle. Her connection to one of the men complicates everything, of course. Blood ties thread through their relationship, turning loyalty into something more tangled and more dangerous. That bond pulled me in, because it reminded me of how messy family always is. We tell ourselves it's simple, that love is enough, but in reality it's layered with resentment, with history, with the ache of what could have been. Watching the way she stood between trust and suspicion, between duty and love, I saw echoes of real-life dilemmas. Those moments where the people closest to us become the very ones we doubt the most. And then there is the antagonist, who fascinated me in a completely different way. He is not merely a villain, but an embodiment of fear, the fear of obsolescence. His body is more machine than man, his words heavy with conviction that evolution has left humanity behind. He is terrifying not because he is evil for evil's sake, but because he believes he is right. That kind of certainty is chilling. I watched him and thought about history's great mistakes, the leaders who justified cruelty in the name of progress, who cloaked destruction in the language of inevitability. What makes him compelling is not just his physical dominance, but his philosophy, that humanity, in its flawed, fragile state, deserves to be replaced. He doesn't just want to win. He wants to erase. And yet, as I watched him, I felt something else too, pity. Because beneath the power, beneath the augmentation, is a man who gave up his humanity for the promise of being unbreakable. But in doing so, he lost the very thing that makes humanity worth saving: connection, vulnerability, imperfection. He became a ghost of what we fear the most, a future where we are no longer needed. The supporting figures in the story also breathe life into this tapestry. The family members back on the island, with their simmering resentment and buried love, reveal the complexity of what it means to belong. The brothers who see betrayal instead of sacrifice, the elders who demand respect even when they feel forgotten. Each of them adds weight to the protagonist's arc. I was particularly moved by how these dynamics weren't resolved neatly, but messily, with grudges that don't vanish overnight. That felt real. In my own family, forgiveness has never been clean or immediate. It has been slow, jagged, always carrying scars. Seeing that reflected here gave the story a surprising depth amid all its noise. Even the smaller players, the scientists, the allies met along the way, served as reminders of the world's fragility. Some were cowardly, some brave, some selfish, some generous. Together, they reminded me that humanity is never uniform, that in times of crisis we reveal our truest selves, whether that self is noble or cruel. What ties all these characters together, though, is the way they are shaped by opposition. The two leads are defined by their differences, yet saved by their ability to find common ground. The woman is defined by the weight of her burden, yet empowered by her refusal to surrender. The villain is defined by his strength, yet hollowed out by the humanity he abandoned. Every one of them is locked in a dance of contradiction, and it is that contradiction that makes the story resonate. As I sat with these characters afterward, I realized how much they had reflected my own life back at me. I thought of the parts of myself that are stubborn, unwilling to bend. I thought of the times I've hidden behind humor to mask my fear. I thought of the people I've loved who carried burdens without complaint, and of the fears I've held about being replaced, forgotten, outpaced by a world moving faster than I can follow. These characters, for all their exaggeration, felt like mirrors. And perhaps that's why they lingered in my mind long after the explosions faded. What makes them memorable isn't just their strength or their spectacle. It's their humanity, messy, flawed, contradictory, vulnerable humanity. And in that humanity, I found a reflection of myself, of all of us, stumbling through a world that often feels too big, too fast, too impossible, yet still finding ways to connect, to endure, to survive. What always fascinates me when I step away from the screen and lean into the whispers of production is how the real story, the one behind the polished images, is sometimes stranger than the fiction we are shown. Sitting with my notes, I began to uncover little anecdotes, curious details, and half-forgotten stories about this particular film, and what struck me was how the strangeness of its making felt like an echo of its narrative, chaotic, unexpected, filled with clashes, but also brimming with a certain humor that only happens when you bring so many large personalities together under one roof. What I want to share here is not a list of facts, but more like a long walk through the corridors of memory, retelling the things that made me smile, shake my head, or pause with wonder. The first thing that stood out to me was the sheer magnitude of personalities on set. Imagine a space where two very different forces, two men whose entire screen presence is built on dominance, are suddenly standing shoulder to shoulder, asked to share the stage in equal measure. From the very beginning, I found stories of how even the production crew quietly joked about needing to keep a scoreboard, not for the characters, but for the actors themselves. Every day became its own strange dance of who got the last word, who managed the more impressive stunt, who appeared tougher, funnier, or louder. And though it might sound exhausting, I couldn't help but imagine the mischievous energy that must have hummed beneath it all, like watching two boys on a playground trying to outdo each other with tricks. One anecdote that stuck with me was how their contracts reportedly contained meticulous clauses about fight sequences. It wasn't just about who threw the punch. It was about how many punches landed, how many were blocked, and how much damage each character could show afterward. I sat with that for a long while, marveling at the sheer strangeness of measuring masculinity by a tally of bruises and scratches. It felt almost Shakespearean, in its own absurd way, like a modern reimagining of old feuds where honor was calculated in wounds and victories. What must it have felt like for the stunt coordinators, constantly calculating balance, not just for choreography, but for ego? It makes me laugh to think of someone with a clipboard, marking down 2 punches for him, 1 for the other, as if refereeing a game no one dared admit was being played. And yet, amid this contest of wills, there were moments of pure levity that softened everything. Crew members often shared that laughter was a constant presence, that the rivalry never sank into cruelty. One of the strangest but funniest images I came across was of the 2 leads taking turns mocking each other's training routines. On screen, they are titans, unyielding, almost superhuman. Off-screen, they were men rolling their eyes at protein shakes, cracking jokes about bicep curls, and sneaking in quips about who had the better jawline. The absurdity of that makes me grin, because it reminds me of how we all, no matter how powerful we might appear, are still drawn to the petty, silly comfort of teasing the people we're secretly trying to impress. But not everything was playful. The production itself carried its share of odd hurdles. One of the strangest details that surfaced was about locations. Much of the film needed gritty, industrial, almost dystopian backdrops, and so the crew ventured into places that were less than welcoming. I read about abandoned factories where the smell of rust lingered in the air, where stray animals wandered through the rubble, and where crews had to carefully avoid hazardous debris that could have sent the entire shoot into chaos. The oddest part? Sometimes those unpredictable intrusions made the takes better. Imagine a scene where tension is already high, and then suddenly a loud clang from a forgotten corner echoes through the space. An accident that added an authenticity no sound designer could have staged. Even more unusual were the technical experiments. The villain's part of the story required not just stunt work, but an elaborate merging of human performance with technological illusions. To achieve this, the actor often had to move in ways that made no sense in real time, jerking unnaturally, twisting his body to match sequences that would later be enhanced with visual effects. Crew members recounted watching him on set, moving almost like a puppet under invisible strings, and feeling both unsettled and amused. To me, that image feels eerie, a man imitating a machine imitating a man. It blurs the line between actor and role, and I can't help but think how strange it must have felt to embody the very thing the character feared, losing his humanity to artifice. And then there were the stunts themselves. Strange, sometimes terrifying little truths hide behind the slick choreography. One story tells of how a sequence involving a car stunt nearly went very wrong when the timing of a detonation was slightly off. No one was injured, but the adrenaline that must have pulsed through the crew afterward was unforgettable. There is something oddly beautiful about how danger hangs over films like this, a silent companion to every leap, every explosion. Knowing that, as polished as it looks, chaos lurked just behind the curtain, makes me watch the scenes differently now. I can't help but notice the sharpness in their eyes, the way bodies move just a little faster than choreography might demand, as if instinct is always reminding them that even pretend danger can cross the line into real. The trivia, too, has its charm. Did you know that one of the actors had a habit of rewriting his lines on the spot, adding in quips or insults that were never in the script? At first, this drove the writers mad, but eventually, it became part of the process. The directors even encouraged it, realizing that the spontaneous remarks often carried more bite, more rhythm, more authenticity than anything penned in a quiet office. That strangeness, that willingness to let chaos spill into the text, gave the film its pulse. When I think about it, it feels like a reminder that art thrives not in control, but in surrender, in letting go enough to let accidents bloom into brilliance. There's also a story about a prop, a small object, not meant to carry weight, that somehow became a recurring joke among the crew. It was a coffee cup, plain and unremarkable, yet it appeared in shot after shot, always hidden, always out of focus. No one outside the production would ever notice, but within the crew it became a game, a secret signature they carried through the film. I love that. There is something deeply human about leaving little inside jokes scattered across work, reminders that art, no matter how massive or corporate, is still shaped by people who want to laugh, to play, to claim it as their own. But perhaps the strangest fact of all lies not in the production itself, but in the reception. Long after the cameras stopped rolling, when the movie was released to the world, viewers and critics alike found themselves debating not just the story, but the energy between the two leads. Some praised it as electric, others criticized it as forced, and still others saw in it a strange parody of masculinity itself. What fascinates me is that, in many ways, this divided response mirrors the divided production. Half rivalry, half camaraderie, always teetering between conflict and cohesion. The strangeness of the set seeped into the final product, and in that way, the film became a reflection of its own making. As I think back on all these little stories, contracts that counted punches, industrial ruins doubling as stages, an actor moving like a machine, a coffee cup hiding in plain sight, I realize how much more alive the film feels when you know what pulsed beneath it. For me, these strange facts don't diminish the spectacle. They deepen it. They remind me that movies are never clean illusions. They are messy, human endeavors, stitched together with rivalry, danger, laughter, and accidents. And perhaps that is what makes them endure. Not their perfection, but their imperfections, the strange truths hidden behind the curtain that somehow make the magic on screen feel even more real. What I always find remarkable when revisiting this film is not simply the roar of engines or the choreography of fists, though those are impressive in their own right, but how the story reveals itself through events that feel both exaggerated and strangely intimate. The action is outsized, the explosions thunderous, the scale nearly absurd, and yet at the heart of it all lies a series of moments that, when examined critically, reveal themes of identity, loyalty, pride, and the ongoing struggle between self and society. To walk through the events of the story from this perspective is less like reading a plot and more like peeling away layers of a myth. There is the visible spectacle, and then there is the undercurrent of human truth hiding beneath. The opening sequences, with their parallel rhythms, introduce us not to a world, but to two men. We see them in separate environments, yet what connects these images is the way they are framed. One moves through his morning in a silence that feels ritualistic, while the other fills his space with noise, charm, and defiance. These moments are not merely character introductions, they are thematic foreshadowing. By splitting the screen between stoic control and chaotic wit, the film invites us to meditate on the question of duality. What happens when two radically different energies collide, and how can two opposing forces find common ground? In literary terms, it is almost like opening a dialogue between Apollo and Dionysus, between order and abandon. The narrative here sets up a conversation about masculinity and rivalry that continues through every later scene. When the inciting incident arrives, the theft of the deadly technology, the event functions on multiple levels. On the surface, it's the typical call to adventure. Something has been stolen, a villain is rising, the world is in danger. But critically, what fascinates me is how the event operates as a catalyst not just for action, but for reluctant cooperation. The theft isn't simply a plot device. It's an excuse for institutions to force two men together who would never willingly share the same oxygen. From a narrative analysis standpoint, this isn't about the object stolen at all. It's about the friction that follows, the forced partnership that drives the film's energy. The theft is a mirror, reminding us that often what we chase externally is far less important than the transformation it demands internally. The first true meeting of the two leads in that interrogation room is one of the film's most significant events, though not because of violence or spectacle. It's a battle of words, a volley of insults and glares, an almost theatrical display of disdain. What I found compelling when I first watched it, and even more so in reflection, is how it operates like a compressed play. The space is enclosed, the props minimal, and the dialogue carries the weight of performance. We are essentially watching two men audition their egos for each other, desperately trying not to be the first to blink. From a critical lens, this moment resonates as commentary on the construction of identity. Both are performing versions of themselves, not just for each other, but for the imagined audience of everyone who has ever underestimated them. It is both comical and tragic, because beneath the bravado lies the truth that each fears irrelevance, each fears being overshadowed. The chase that follows, when both are thrown together against a common enemy, presents another significant turning point. What begins as reluctant parallel movement soon becomes begrudging cooperation. And here lies an interesting thematic resonance. The choreography of the chase mimics the choreography of relationships. At first they stumble, collide, resist one another. Gradually, however, necessity forces rhythm. The strange truth of human bonds is reflected here. We rarely choose harmony, but we stumble into it when survival demands it. The scene works not just as spectacle, but as metaphor, echoing the way opposites often find balance not in peace, but in the chaos of shared danger. The introduction of the sister shifts the narrative's emotional terrain in profound ways. Her presence complicates everything, because she represents both personal history and present stakes. On the surface, she is a key to the stolen technology, but critically, she functions as a mirror. To her brother, she embodies the unresolved tension of family, loyalty fractured by betrayal, love tangled with resentment. To the stoic partner, she represents the fragility of trust, because suddenly their mission is not abstract. It is tied to blood, to emotion, to something he cannot simply muscle through. What struck me most was how her entrance reoriented the energy. No longer was this a battle of egos. It became a story about what we owe to family, about how personal bonds complicate public duty. From a critical perspective, her role underscores one of the film's core themes: the inescapable gravity of kinship, even when it threatens to destroy us. The villain's unveiling deepens this thematic undercurrent. His very body, fused with machinery, is an allegory for what happens when one rejects vulnerability altogether. He has abandoned the fragility of flesh, the softness of humanity, in pursuit of unyielding power. And what makes his presence significant isn't just his threat to the world, but his role as a distorted reflection of the protagonists. He is, in essence, what both men could become if they surrender entirely to pride. A man who no longer feels, who no longer needs anyone, who has cut himself free from the web of human connection in exchange for invincibility. From a critical perspective, his character transforms the conflict from an external chase into an internal question. Do we preserve our humanity, or do we sacrifice it for control? One of the most striking events, emotionally speaking, occurs when the trio flees into hiding and must confront each other not as adversaries, but as uneasy allies. Around those quieter moments, in borrowed safe houses and dimly lit spaces, the story takes a breath. And it is in these pauses that the true battles occur. Here, the insults soften into confessions, the mockery masks grudging respect, and the woman's calm conviction threads them together. These moments remind us that even in a film built on speed and force, intimacy is what gives it resonance. It's not the explosions we carry with us afterward, but the memory of two stubborn men slowly learning to share space without tearing each other apart. The journey back to one man's homeland is, in my view, one of the film's most thematically rich events. It's not just a change of scenery, it's a confrontation with past sins, with the family abandoned, with the culture left behind. Watching him walk back into that world, braced against resentment, felt to me like watching the archetypal heroes return. The prodigal son, yes, but also the exile seeking forgiveness. Thematically, this moment resonates as a meditation on belonging. No matter how far we run, the past waits. The anger of brothers, the disappointment of elders, the complicated love of kin. All these elements converge into a storm of identity that no amount of physical strength can easily weather. What lingers here is not just the spectacle of a different setting, but the emotional weight of returning home. The final confrontation, of course, is significant not just for its scale, but for its resolution of themes. When the two men fight together at last, not as reluctant partners, but as allies, their unity transforms the narrative. The punches, the explosions, the weapons, all of it is less important than the symbolism of cooperation. In critical terms, the climax functions as a reconciliation of opposites. Order and chaos, silence and noise, muscle and wit merged. The villain falls not because of brute strength or clever tricks alone, but because unity triumphs where division could not. Thematically, this reinforces the story's moral heart. No individual, no matter how powerful, survives in isolation. Humanity's strength lies not in perfection, but in the messy, reluctant, necessary act of working together. Even the resolution, with its quieter coda, carries resonance. The lingering tension between siblings, the unspoken truce between rivals, the promise of unfinished business. All these elements resist the neat bow of closure. And I find that significant. By leaving threads untied, the film acknowledges the truth that human relationships are rarely clean, rarely resolved in a single victory. Conflict lingers, love complicates, pride resurfaces. In this sense, the story remains alive beyond its final frame, echoing in the unresolved questions it leaves us to ponder. From a critical perspective, the film's events are less about plot than about pattern. Each significant moment, whether a chase, a fight, or a quiet exchange, returns us to the same questions. How do we reconcile difference? How do we face the past without being devoured by it? How do we preserve our humanity in the face of forces that demand we abandon it? These are not questions answered with fists or fireballs. They are questions woven into the fabric of human existence. And that, I think, is why the film endures in my memory. Not for its explosions, though they were grand. Not for its stunts, though they were impressive. But for the way it smuggled into its spectacle a conversation about pride, loyalty, family, and humanity's strange dance with vulnerability. Beneath the noise, there is something tender. A reminder that even the strongest among us are still searching for connection, still stumbling toward the fragile act of trust. There is a certain magic in watching a movie unfold on screen. The roar of engines, the crack of fists, the sudden stillness when two characters glare at one another as though the world might split open if either of them blinks. But what always fascinates me even more is stepping behind that curtain, into the world where lights, cameras, contracts, tempers, and laughter swirl together in an alchemy as chaotic and unpredictable as the story itself. With this film, the tales from its making are sometimes so unusual, so oddly human, that they almost outshine the narrative we were given. To walk through its production is to wander through a carnival of egos, accidents, jokes, frustrations, and triumphs, and somehow, all of it stitched itself together into the glossy spectacle we came to know. From the very beginning, the project carried an energy of both ambition and caution. Think about it. Taking two established characters from a larger universe and giving them their own playground was not a small gamble. The studio was careful, almost calculating, in its decisions. They didn't just want a spin-off, they wanted a statement. The question became, how do you take two men whose entire identities rest on dominance and rivalry and place them side by side without either being eclipsed? That was the puzzle the filmmakers faced even before a camera rolled. And it shaped everything that followed, from script revisions to stunt choreography to the very rhythm of editing. One of the strangest truths about this process was the almost mathematical precision that governed fight scenes. Contracts reportedly contained clauses that dictated not just how often each man could be hit, but how badly each could appear hurt. It wasn't enough for the punches to look real. They had to be balanced, as if someone backstage was keeping score. Imagine a stunt coordinator with a clipboard marking down 3 hits for him, 2 for the other, even it out next scene. It sounds absurd, but it was real. And in a way, it feels like a perfect reflection of the characters themselves. Prideful, unwilling to concede, locked in an endless duel of image. I can't help but smile at the thought of lawyers sitting across a table, negotiating bruises like currency. The actors themselves leaned into this rivalry, but not without humor. Crew members spoke of constant teasing, of jokes thrown back and forth like soft punches between takes. On screen, they glare and scowl. Off screen, they sometimes collapsed into laughter, mocking one another's routines, diets, and even walk cycles. There's a story about how one would deliberately mimic the other's stride during downtime, exaggerating every motion until the entire crew was laughing. What struck me most about this was the humanity of it. Beneath the towering egos and larger-than-life personas were simply two men, as competitive and playful as brothers locked in an endless game. The filming process itself was not without its quirks. Many of the set pieces demanded environments that were far from comfortable. Industrial ruins, abandoned warehouses, and unfamiliar cityscapes became playgrounds for chaos. But the strangeness of filming in such locations is that life refuses to pause just because Hollywood has rolled in. There are stories of stray animals wandering onto set mid-take, of nearby construction noise ruining carefully staged moments, of local residents stopping to watch and unintentionally becoming part of the background. Some of these interruptions were nuisances, but some added a spark of authenticity that couldn't be planned. I imagine those moments as little accidents that slipped through the cracks, unnoticed by audiences, but deeply felt by the people who were there. And then, of course, there were the stunts. Every action film is built on a foundation of risk, but this one seemed particularly eager to flirt with chaos. One sequence involving vehicles and timed detonations nearly went sideways when a delay in the explosives almost caught a stunt driver off guard. No one was harmed, but the fear that rippled across the crew lingered long after. What fascinated me, though, was how the people involved responded. Instead of collapsing into blame, They treated it as a reminder of the razor-thin line they walked every day. There's something oddly poetic in that. The beauty of spectacle depends on the willingness of real people to face real danger, again and again, all so that the audience might gasp in a darkened theatre. Beyond the stunts and locations, what I found most interesting were the smaller, almost hidden stories. One actor developed a habit of rewriting his lines on set, adding in quips and insults that hadn't been scripted. At first, this frustrated the writers, who had spent months crafting dialogue. But eventually, everyone realized that the improvisation was adding texture, rhythm, and authenticity. Those little unscripted moments often became the lines audiences remembered most. To me, this reveals something profound about filmmaking. It is not a rigid art, but a living one. No matter how carefully planned, the best work often emerges from spontaneity, from surrendering to the unexpected. Even props carried their share of quirks. There was, for example, a running joke about a coffee cup that kept appearing in shots, hidden just enough to avoid notice, yet placed there intentionally by mischievous crew members. It became a game, a secret signature threaded through the film, a wink to those who knew. These little inside jokes always warm me, because they remind me that films, no matter how massive or corporate, are made by human beings who crave play, who leave fingerprints of mischief on the grand canvas of spectacle. The villain's portrayal also carried its own strangeness. To embody a character enhanced by technology, the actor often had to move unnaturally, jerking and twisting in ways that looked bizarre in real time. Crew members reportedly found themselves unsettled watching him, almost as though he had become something not quite human. I find that image powerful. A man pretending to be a machine pretending to be a man. In a way, the performance itself became a meta-commentary on the story's themes, blurring the line between flesh and artifice even during production. But not all stories are amusing. The tension of managing such strong personalities sometimes seeped into the air. Directors and producers had to walk a fine line, balancing egos while keeping the story coherent. There were whispered tales of arguments over creative choices, of long nights spent smoothing over disputes. And yet, out of that tension came energy. In many ways, the friction behind the camera mirrored the friction in front of it. The movie feels alive because it was born of conflict, not harmony. That, to me, is one of the strangest and most beautiful truths of filmmaking. Sometimes art thrives not because of unity, but because of discord. As I sat with these anecdotes, I began to realize that the film is as much about its making as it is about its story. Each fun fact, each behind-the-scenes struggle or joke, adds a layer to its identity. When I think of the car chases now, I also think of the crew member nervously watching the countdown on an explosive. When I recall the witty insults, I imagine the laughter that followed after the camera's cut. When I see the villain's mechanical stride, I remember the actor contorting his body into something uncanny under fluorescent lights. Knowing these details makes the final product feel less like an illusion and more like a tapestry, woven from ego, humor, accident, and determination. And perhaps that is what I love most about learning the strange facts of film production. It reveals the human fingerprints beneath the gloss. The contracts that counted bruises, the coffee cup hidden in plain sight, the unplanned improvisations, the dangerous near misses. All of it whispers of the fragile, messy, unpredictable humanity that creates the art we take for granted. Watching the movie now, I no longer see only a story of fists and explosions. I see the invisible world behind it, the laughter and fear, the rivalries and reconciliations, the moments of chaos that shape the spectacle. What lingers in my mind long after the thunder of explosions and the crack of fists has faded is not always the plot or even the characters, but the landscapes that held them, the textures of light and shadow that gave their movements meaning. Settings are more than just places. They are characters of their own, carrying memory, weight, and tone. In this film, the settings do not simply contain the action. They amplify it, push it forward, color it with mood, and sometimes even contradict it. To sit with the cinematic elements is to realize that the world we saw on screen was crafted with as much care and precision as the fight choreography itself, and perhaps even more mystery. The opening sequences, with their divided storytelling, tell us everything we need to know without saying a word. One man wakes up in Los Angeles, bathed in the golden hues of morning sun, the city sprawling in both chaos and possibility. The cinematography lingers on his strength in close-up, but around him, the city feels impersonal, glass towers, cold steel, wide highways that blur into anonymity. His world is rigid, structured, urban. In contrast, The other man's introduction bursts with neon, crowded pubs, the messy vibrancy of London. The camera swoops in and out of tight alleyways, quick cuts mirroring the speed of his tongue, the restlessness in his body. In one sequence, two settings already tell us who they are. The first a fortress, the second a whirlwind. Without these landscapes, their characters would feel flatter. With them, they become archetypes of place, products of their environments. Later, when the chase begins and the story moves through industrial spaces, the atmosphere changes entirely. Factories gutted of life, rust eating into steel, shadows hanging heavy. These locations are not chosen for spectacle alone. They echo the story's undercurrent. Decay, the looming threat of dehumanization, the villain's vision of a world where humanity itself is obsolete. I remember the texture of those shots, the way the cinematography allowed light to spill through broken windows, creating harsh contrasts between brightness and dark. That chiaroscuro effect reminded me of old noir films, where morality itself was painted in shades of grey. Here, too, it is not simple good versus evil. It is a messy, shadow-filled world where alliances are reluctant and trust is fragile. The safe houses and smaller interiors, by contrast, are stripped of grandeur. Bare walls, dim lamps, cluttered tables. What fascinates me is how these intimate spaces shift the tone. In the vastness of the chase scenes, the men look like titans. But in these close, narrow rooms, they look almost small, forced to confront not just their enemy, but each other. The cinematography leans into this by drawing the camera close, letting us see sweat on foreheads, the flicker of a glance, the tightening of a jaw. It's in these settings that humor blossoms most fully. The tension of confined space forcing sarcasm, mockery, and reluctant honesty. The contrast is deliberate. Outside, they fight to survive the world. Inside, they fight to survive each other. And then comes the homeland. The moment the story shifts into wide, sun-soaked landscapes, everything changes. Gone are the muted palettes of steel and shadow. In their place are lush greens, open skies, and the raw beauty of nature. This is not just aesthetic, it is symbolic. The island represents history, blood, and identity. The shots widen, the camera often pulling back to let us feel the expanse of space, the weight of ancestral land beneath the protagonist's feet. What I found moving about these scenes is how the setting itself seemed to demand humility. Against the backdrop of towering cliffs and vast oceans, even the strongest men looked small. This, too, was a statement. No matter how mighty, we are always dwarfed by where we come from. Cinematography leaned heavily on contrasts throughout the film. Brightness versus shadow, wide shots versus close-ups, speed versus stillness. In moments of action, the camera cut quickly, often handheld, making us feel the chaos, the breathless urgency of survival. But in moments of reflection, especially when family dynamics came into play, the camera lingered, slower, steadier, as though allowing us to sit with discomfort. I think of the way the camera held on the protagonist's face as he re-entered his family home, the flicker of resentment in his brother's eyes caught not in dialogue, but in silence, in framing. This is the kind of visual storytelling that speaks louder than words. Even the use of color struck me as deliberate. The urban settings leaned cold, steel grays, sharp whites, neon blues, evoking sterility and impersonality. The villain's layers mirrored this, metallic and clinical, emphasizing his obsession with technology and control. In contrast, the island pulsed with warmth, greens, browns, the glow of firelight. It was a return to earth, to roots, to humanity. Watching the shift in palette felt like watching the story itself shift from machine to man, from ego to community. Sound design, too, worked hand in hand with setting. In the industrial landscapes, every clang echoed, every footstep reverberated, creating a sense of emptiness, of danger lurking unseen. In the pubs and crowded city streets, sound was layered, overlapping conversations and music, amplifying the chaos of one character's life. And on the island, the soundtrack leaned into natural noises, waves, birds, the rustle of wind through trees, reminding us that despite all the technology and destruction, the earth itself still speaks louder. This layering of sound with place made each environment feel alive, not just backdrops but breathing organisms. What impressed me most was how the settings themselves seemed to mirror the internal journeys of the characters. The stoic agent thrives in sterile, controlled spaces, but on the island, surrounded by emotion and family, he is forced into vulnerability. The sly outsider, born of chaos, finds himself strangely at home in the mess of pubs and city streets, but must adjust when stripped of distractions and faced with raw nature. Even the villain is framed by his environment, cold, mechanical, devoid of warmth. These juxtapositions remind us that environment is not neutral. It shapes, challenges, and reveals us. One of the subtler cinematic choices that stayed with me was the way mirrors and reflections were used. In several scenes, glass or polished metal caught a character's face, splitting their image or distorting it. It's easy to overlook, but I found it powerful. Thematically, this story is about duality. Two men who despise each other yet share the same wound. A villain who is both man and machine. Visually, reflections reinforce this duality, reminding us that identity is never singular, that every person is fractured, doubled, hiding something behind the surface. Even action sequences carried layers of meaning when considered critically. The chase through narrow alleys, for instance, wasn't just adrenaline. It was claustrophobia, the physical manifestation of two men refusing to share space. The wide battles on the island weren't just spectacle. They were about expansion, about breaking free from the constraints of ego and stepping into something larger, something communal. Cinematography doesn't just record movement. It interprets it, translates it into metaphor. And yet, amid all these deliberate choices, accidents sometimes shaped beauty. A stray beam of sunlight breaking through clouds during a confrontation, a gust of wind catching loose fabric at just the right moment. These serendipities gave the settings a kind of grace no one could have scripted. It's in those accidents that I am reminded filmmaking is not just control, but also surrender, allowing the world itself to leave fingerprints on the art. Looking back, I realized that what gave the film its atmosphere was not the spectacle alone, but the interplay between place and people. The sterile cityscapes told us about isolation. The gritty factories reminded us of decay. The close safe houses forced intimacy. The lush island demanded humility. Cinematography stitched these environments together, balancing chaos and stillness, shadow and light, until the world on screen felt less like fiction and more like myth. And perhaps that is why the film continues to linger in my memory. Not for the stunts, though they were impressive. Not for the one-liners, though some were sharp. But for the way place itself became a character. For the way cities, ruins, and islands shaped the story as much as fists and weapons did. Watching it was like watching a conversation between people and their environments, between humanity and the spaces it inhabits, between chaos and control. When I think about the making of this film, what captivates me most is not just the explosions, the roaring engines, or the dazzling fight choreography we all saw on screen, but the quieter, stranger, and sometimes hilarious truths of what went on behind the curtain. There's always something oddly comforting in realizing that, beneath the surface of a giant blockbuster production, with its staggering budgets and globe-trotting locations, there are still moments of human awkwardness, improvisation, and laughter, the very things that make any creative project feel alive. And when you start to piece together these behind-the-scenes threads, you discover a story just as fascinating as the one we were given in the theater. One of the first things that always comes to my mind when reflecting on this film's production is how enormous the scale really was. Imagine entire city blocks closed off, streets in both London and Glasgow transformed into sets for the high-octane sequences, helicopters buzzing overhead, while dozens of stunt coordinators choreographed complex moves down below. It almost seems impossible that so many moving parts could come together without total chaos, and yet somehow they did. But even within that enormous machinery, there were these small, funny moments. Actors breaking character because of a forgotten line, someone accidentally tripping during an intense scene, or a car stunt rehearsed again, and again not because of safety, but because the camera caught a bystander in the distance with a phone raised, trying to sneak their own behind-the-scenes footage. The camaraderie between the two leading men was something everyone talked about, both in interviews and whispered accounts from crew members. On screen, their banter and rivalry carried the film, but off-screen, that chemistry came from constant teasing, small competitions, and endless improvisation. Between takes, they were said to challenge each other to push-up contests, or argue mock-seriously about whose entrance into a room should look cooler. There's a sort of childlike energy in that kind of interaction, and it bled into their performances. Crew members often joked that half the film's dialogue could have been replaced by their off-screen arguments, and no one would have noticed a difference. That natural flow is what gave the film its texture, its sense of fun. Of course, a production this massive wasn't all games. There were genuine challenges that tested both the cast and crew. The scheduling itself was a nightmare. coordinating international shoots in multiple countries, dealing with weather that refused to cooperate, and managing the physical toll on actors who insisted on performing many of their own stunts. One particularly difficult sequence involved an elaborate chase scene across narrow streets, filled with vehicles, explosions, and a fight spilling into and out of moving cars. On paper, it looked cinematic. In practice, it required weeks of preparation, dozens of rehearsals, and a handful of unplanned delays when minor accidents occurred. Thankfully, no one was seriously hurt, but it highlighted just how precarious large-scale action filmmaking can be. I always find it fascinating how much of what we see on screen is the result of persistence rather than perfection. There's a story of one of the lead actors repeatedly struggling with a stunt where he had to leap onto a moving truck. He tried it again and again, refusing to use a double, until finally landing it in a take that made the entire crew erupt in applause. Watching the final film, you'd never guess at the frustration or the dozens of failed attempts. It looks smooth, heroic, almost effortless. But knowing the truth gives it a kind of deeper meaning. What looks easy is almost always the result of relentless failure behind the scenes. What really delights me, though, are the odd little surprises. During the shoot in Samoa, for example, there were reports of entire families from nearby villages gathering at a distance to watch the filming unfold. The production became something of a community event, with locals invited to participate as background actors. Some of the chants and traditional dances we saw on screen weren't just rehearsed by the cast. They were rooted in the authentic culture of the people who lived there. The actors themselves spoke later about how humbling it was to be welcomed so warmly, to be taught the rhythms and rituals, and to realize that this wasn't just spectacle. It was storytelling anchored in heritage. That authenticity, I think, gave the island scenes their depth. Of course, no behind-the-scenes tale would be complete without a bit of mischief. Crew members recalled how one actor had a habit of sneaking unexpected jokes into serious takes, just to break his co-star's composure. In one scene, instead of delivering the scripted line, he improvised something ridiculous, sending his partner into such uncontrollable laughter that the cameras had to cut. Moments like these, while costly in terms of time, kept morale high during grueling shoots. They also reminded everyone that even in a blockbuster loaded with responsibility, it was still okay to laugh, to let go, to remember the joy of play. Filming also required careful workarounds. There were sequences set in exotic locations that were, in truth, shot on meticulously designed sets. The art department poured astonishing detail into recreating these environments, down to weathering walls and scattering debris, so that everything looked lived in. Watching it later, you'd swear it was filmed on location. But it was all crafted magic, the kind of illusion cinema thrives on. There's something almost poetic about that. The act of creating a world so convincing that even those present on set sometimes forgot it wasn't real. And then there's the physicality. Action films demand more from actors than just delivering lines. They require endurance, strength, and a willingness to risk bruises, burns, and exhaustion. Cast members often trained together, not just to build stamina, but to foster unity. They'd spend hours with stunt teams, practicing fight choreography until it became second nature, like a dance. What touched me most was hearing how the stunt performers themselves, those unsung heroes, often became close friends with the actors they doubled for. There was mutual respect, a recognition that without the skill of the stunt teams, none of the larger-than-life moments would have been possible. Weather, too, played its part in shaping the film. In one location, torrential rain threatened to shut down shooting for days, forcing the crew to scramble for indoor alternatives. But instead of letting it ruin the plan, the director decided to adapt, incorporating the rain into the atmosphere of the scene. What began as a challenge became a gift, lending the sequence a raw, visceral energy. This willingness to pivot, to embrace the unexpected, is what made the production resilient. It's a reminder that art is often forged not in the absence of obstacles, but through them. I can't help but think of the smaller, more personal moments that emerged in the midst of the spectacle. There was a story about one of the actors taking time between scenes to connect with young fans who had been granted access to watch filming. He signed autographs, posed for photos, even joked around with them in character. For those kids, it must have felt like stepping into the movie itself. For the actor, it was a way of grounding himself, of remembering why these stories matter, to inspire, to entertain, to spark imagination. And yet, despite all the chaos, the exhaustion, the endless hours, Many crew members described the production as one of the most rewarding of their careers. It wasn't just because of the paychecks or the prestige, but because of the sense of community that formed. They were working towards something massive, yes, but they were also sharing meals, laughing at mistakes, comforting each other during long nights. It's easy to forget, watching the polished final product, that movies are made by people, by hands and hearts working in tandem. Even the villain's presence on set carried an odd kind of electricity. His transformation into the role required long hours in the makeup chair, adjusting costume pieces, and coordinating with stunt teams to balance his menacing physicality with the subtler demands of performance. Off-camera, though, he was reportedly one of the friendliest presences, often lightening the mood with stories or jokes. There's something delicious about that contrast. The most terrifying character on screen being the warmest off of it. When the cameras stopped rolling, many of these stories never made the headlines, but they linger in the memories of those who were there. They're the kinds of tales that give texture to the polished veneer of the movie, reminding us that art is never seamless. It's messy, unpredictable, full of accidents and improvisations. And yet it's in those imperfections, in the laughter between takes, in the storm that forced a new direction, that the heart of the production really beats. And so, when I revisit the film now, I no longer see just the battles, the vehicles, or the dazzling choreography. I see the laughter that bubbled behind the camera, the sweat of stunt performers, the families gathered on the sidelines of a Samoan beach. I see the exhaustion on faces between takes, the pride of a leap finally landed, the rain that refused to stop but instead became part of the story. These behind-the-scenes moments are what give the film its soul. When I think back on this film, I can't help but feel that beneath the roaring engines, the bone-crunching fights, and the endless banter that seemed to never run out of steam, there was something subtler at play. A series of echoes, reminders, and unspoken questions about what it means to be human, to belong, to wrestle with the weight of pride, and to choose connection over isolation. To me, these weren't just stunts dressed up with witty lines. They were metaphors, shadows of something larger lurking beneath the adrenaline. And that's what makes the exploration of its themes and symbolism so rewarding. Once you peel away the spectacle, you begin to see the soft beating heart that anchors the story. One of the first themes that struck me was duality. The film's entire premise hinges on two men who, on the surface, couldn't be more different. One is disciplined, structured, a product of control and law. The other is wild, instinctive, allergic to authority. Their lives are split down the middle, their approaches to problem-solving laughably opposed. And yet, isn't that how duality often works? Opposites defined not by their distance, but by their proximity? The film keeps reminding us that these men are two halves of the same whole. Every time the camera frames them side by side, it feels like watching two mirrors trying desperately not to admit their reflection. To me, that's more than just comedy. It's a meditation on how much we resist what we recognize in ourselves. This duality carries through the imagery as well. London's cold steel and neon, buzz contrasts with Samoa's warmth and open skies. The villain's sterile, metallic layers clash with the earthy textures of ancestral land. Even in cinematography, there is constant tension. Wide, expansive shots paired with claustrophobic interiors, moments of blinding brightness offset by sudden plunges into shadow. It's as though the film is whispering, the world is always split, control versus chaos, tradition versus progress, isolation versus belonging. That rhythm of contrasts isn't just a stylistic flourish, it mirrors the character's own struggles. And then there's the theme of family. It's impossible to ignore how deeply the story insists on it, weaving it through dialogue, setting, and even the choreography of battles. The hardened lawman insists he needs no one, yet he's defined by his role as a father, the tattoo of responsibility inked across his choices. The quick-talking outsider scoffs at trust, yet every barb he throws is secretly a shield for the brother he can't quite reach. The villain, curiously, is stripped of family altogether, rebuilt into something inhuman, and it is precisely that absence, the emptiness of belonging, that drives his vision of the world. Family isn't just a subplot here, it's the battlefield. The push and pull of blood, of connection, of legacy, is what underpins the film's loudest explosions. Symbolism lingers most powerfully in the island sequences. The return to ancestral soil feels less like a plot device and more like a mythic journey. The chants, the fire, the gathering of kin against overwhelming odds, these aren't just action beats. They are reminders of heritage, of roots that stretch deeper than any technology. When the lawman stands before his family, It isn't merely a reunion. It's a confrontation with history. The island becomes a living symbol of identity, raw, unpolished, but immovable. And when machines clash against flesh and spirit there, the symbolism is impossible to ignore. Progress without heart is hollow. What fascinates me even more is the villain as a symbol. He is, quite literally, the embodiment of man merging with machine, of humanity erased in favor of efficiency and power. His body gleams with steel, his movements unervingly precise. But what unsettled me wasn't the technology itself, it was the loss of vulnerability. His transformation symbolizes what happens when pride and ambition strip away empathy. He is the ghost of what the protagonists might become if they surrendered completely to their egos. Strong, efficient, untouchable, and utterly alone. In that sense, he's not just a villain, but a cautionary mirror. Another theme that surfaces repeatedly is trust. Throughout the story, every interaction between the two leads is a negotiation of trust, usually masked with humor or hostility. They can't admit reliance, yet they constantly save each other. The symbolism here often lies in physical movement. Hands catching at the last moment, one body pulling another from a ledge, the exchange of weapons in the heat of battle. These aren't just action beats. They're visual metaphors for learning to lean on someone else, even when pride insists otherwise. And every time they do, the film reminds us that trust is not spoken. It is enacted, often reluctantly, often without acknowledgement. Humor itself becomes symbolic too. Every sarcastic quip, every insult hurled back and forth, is more than just comic relief. It's armor. Words are weapons that keep vulnerability at bay. Their banter symbolizes the fear of intimacy, the terror of exposing a wound. Yet slowly, across the story, those sharp edges soften. The humor doesn't disappear, but it changes. Less biting, more playful, less shield, more bridge. Watching that transformation is like watching two people finally lower their masks, even if just for a moment. The film also carries a quieter theme of legacy. The island sequences are drenched in it, but even earlier, there are constant reminders that choices echo. The father's example shapes the daughter, the brother's abandonment shapes the outlaw, the villain's loss shapes his ideology. Legacy, in this sense, isn't just about bloodlines, it's about the residue of our actions. The places we leave, the people we scar or save, these become symbols etched into the narrative. I often think of the tools and weapons handed down in the film, not just as props, but as metaphors for inheritance. What we pass on is never just physical, it's belief, burden, hope. Even vehicles themselves take on symbolic weight. Cars, motorcycles, trucks, they're not just machines of speed or destruction. They symbolize freedom, power, identity. Each character's choice of vehicle reflects their personality. Sleek efficiency, raw force, or chaotic improvisation. When they crash, burn, or fall apart, it isn't just a loss of metal, it's a metaphor for the fragility of control. To watch a machine crumble beneath its driver is to watch the illusion of invincibility break apart. Another striking symbolic layer comes from the constant interplay of natural and artificial. Fire versus steel, blood versus circuits, chant versus algorithm. The story seems obsessed with asking, what happens when the human body collides with the machine? Can flesh triumph over metal? Can tradition withstand progress? The answer the film gives, through every shot of sweat-drenched warriors standing against gleaming weapons, is yes, but only when humanity fights together. Alone, the individual is fragile. United, the human spirit is unstoppable. It's a symbolic message that resonates far beyond action cinema. It's almost mythic in scope. And then there is pride, the silent antagonist. Both leads are enslaved by it, refusing help, mocking vulnerability, clinging to their superiority. Their arcs, more than anything, are about shedding pride. The film symbolizes this through constant physical confrontation. Pride literally gets beaten out of them, bruised away until humility creeps in. By the climax, what matters is no longer who looks stronger or wittier, but who is willing to stand beside another, to put ego aside in service of something larger. Pride may fuel their energy, but humility is what saves them. I find it meaningful, too, how the child in the story symbolizes innocence and future. She isn't central to the plot in the way the adults are, but her presence is like a candle in a storm. She represents why these battles matter, not for glory, not for ego, but for what comes next. Every time the camera lingers on her, it reminds us of stakes beyond survival. She is the symbol of continuity, of hope. Without her, the chaos would feel empty. With her, the fight becomes purposeful. When I look at the larger picture, The film feels less like a clash of fists and more like a meditation on connection. Duality, family, trust, legacy, pride. These aren't isolated themes. They interweave, forming a tapestry of symbols that turn action into allegory. It's why, despite the humor and the spectacle, the story resonates emotionally. Beneath the fireworks lies a question as old as storytelling itself. What does it mean to be human, to stand side by side with another, to fight not alone but together? And that, to me, is why I return to it. Not for the stunts, though they impress me every time, but for the way symbols whisper beneath the noise. For the way pride cracks, family heals, trust grows, and duality resolves into reluctant unity. The film's themes and symbols remind me that even the loudest stories can carry quiet truths, that even in a storm of explosions, there can be something tender, a heartbeat, a reminder